The People's Party, A Brief History of Populism in America, written and narrated by Stephen Leslie. The term populist is thrown around a lot these days. It's most often used in a pejorative sense to connote a political figure or movement that leans toward authoritarianism. The authoritarian is usually a right-wing or ultra-conservative figure who claims to be the voice of the people and the only one who can fix society's problems. The solutions usually involve targeting a scapegoat population, such as immigrants or queer people or socialists. The populist ideologue purports to stand as an outsider against the elite establishment. The press is also targeted as being a propaganda tool of the liberal elites. These kinds of populist movements have successfully undermined democracies, not by violent revolt, but by breaking norms of governing, by waging a hostile takeover of a major political party, by weakening the checks and balances within the system, and by wresting control over democratic institutions so that courts and justice departments lose their independence. We can see these types of negative populism playing out in many places around the world where strongman dictators on both sides of the political spectrum have usurped power in former democracies, such as in Venezuela, Hungary, Turkey, and now in 2025, it is happening here in the US. Populism didn't start out as a launching pad for right-wing authoritarians. In his 2020 book titled The People Know, A Brief History of Anti-Populism, the American historian and social critic Thomas Frank makes a strong case that to label authoritarian movements as populist is historically inaccurate. Populism is not a new idea. In his lectures on politics, Politica, Aristotle proposed land reform and wealth redistribution as two elements for creating a stronger city-state that will therefore be less prone to takeover by oligarchs. He even laid out the mechanisms by how such policy could be equitably and lawfully carried forth. The proper course, he wrote, is to collect all the proceeds of the revenue into a fund and distribute this in lump sums. An American populist movement first took shape as a political force in Nebraska in 1889. Some historians make the case that Andrew Jackson led the first populist wave into the White House, but he could also be described as the first American demagogue, and therefore perhaps not a true populist, as the 1824 movement to expand democracy was dependent on a charismatic figure rather than organized grassroots insurgents. In the late 1880s, prairie farmers in Nebraska were betting on making a good living, meeting the needs of a growing population. The U.S. population had nearly doubled since the end of the Civil War. Half of the population was still agrarian. Favorable rains in the newly established grain belt had yielded bumper harvests and advances in new types of mechanized farm equipment were aiding farmers to become more productive. The trouble was, the U.S. economy had dropped silver in 1873, but was still tied to the gold standard. This resulted in low inflation, and the value of money was increasing over time, which in turn increased interest rates on loans. Farmers were already locked into a system where they needed to borrow from banks to buy land, finance new equipment, and purchase seed and fertilizer. Anyone borrowing at this time could see that the gold standard was putting them deeper into debt. Then the weather patterns in the region turned drier in the 90s. The U.S. economy fell into recession, and the farmers found themselves going bankrupt and starving. Nebraska had been staunchly Republican, but like a grass fire spreading across the prairie, the newly self-denominated Populist Party, after the Latin word populus, designating of the people, quickly gained momentum. At the time of America's founding, the people in the democracy who could vote were white male landowners. By 1890, enfranchisement had been extended to include a much broader swath of the population, including millions of new immigrants and formerly enslaved males, but still excluding women. Wealth was synonymous with power, and political sway was consolidated in the hands of the few. There was a clear, bright line dividing the common man from an elite governing class. That year, out in the heartland, all that began to change. In the elections of 1890, populist candidates in the state of Nebraska won office at every level, from local elections to the governorship. The movement caught on across the country. In 1892, populists won national elections to the House of Representatives and the Senate. Beleaguered farmers from the South and labor unions in northern manufacturing states like New York were joining ranks. The interests of rural and civic labor are the same, proclaimed the 1892 Omaha platform of the People's Party, and their enemies are identical. In 1894, the government under Democratic President Grover Cleveland used federal and state troops to crush the Pullman Railroad workers' strike, led by the future socialist candidate for president, Eugene V. Debs, demonstrating that the capitalist system could and would resort to lethal use of force when it was deemed necessary to protect the interests of the ruling classes. In 1892, the Populists, also known as the People's Party, put forward a presidential candidate, James B. Weaver, who lost but had the strongest showing of any third-party candidate before or since, gaining 1 million votes of the popular electorate, and the party continued to do well down ballot. Their platform was progressive, calling for regulation of the railroads to increase prices paid to farmers by lowering the costs of shipping commodities and manufactured goods, price parity programs to ensure fair trade for farm products, a switch from the unitary gold standard to once again include silver, which would allow the government to print more cash, dissolution of the federal banks, graduated tax rates so that the wealthy would pay their fair share, direct election of candidates to the U.S. Senate, an 8-hour workday for factory workers, suffrage for women, and more. Many white populist farmers also collaborated with black farmer alliances, although not in the unreconstructed South. Although women could not hold office, there were prominent women organizers and orators within the movement. For instance, Mary Elizabeth Lease was a Kansas populist organizer, a lawyer, writer, and commanding speaker who grew famous for her catchphrases at rural meetings, such as, "You farmers need to raise less corn and more hell," and "What we have now is a government of Wall Street, by Wall Street, and for Wall Street." Lease was an ardent socialist and a suffragist who also campaigned for temperance. The populists valued education as a catalyzing tool in the struggle for social justice. Most farmers and members of the working class lacked a formal education, but they recognized the importance of an informed society. Building on the earlier grassroots organizing of the Grange movement and other farmer-led organizations, the populists printed educational pamphlets and organized talks around the country to educate the common people about the issues affecting them. In 1896, the populists chose not to put forward their own candidate and took the more pragmatic approach of backing the young, charismatic first-term Democratic congressman from Nebraska, William Jennings Bryan, in his bid for president. Although not a populist, Bryan took a strong stand on the gold standard issue, ardently advocating for a return to bimetallism, and was sympathetic to other populist causes. Bryan traveled the country, barnstorming, giving speeches at rallies, and raising campaign funds from the common people. Formerly identified as the conservative party of rich Southern elites, the Democratic Party of the 1890s was gaining new ground in the North as the party of the working people. The Eastern urban elites, academics, captains of industry, railroad tycoons, clergymen, and conservative politicians all rallied a strong opposition to defeat Bryan and discredit the populist movement. They tagged the farmers' unions as uneducated, anti-intellectual mobs and used racist and anarchist tropes to discredit the workers' movements, who had high rates of immigrants in their ranks. They used their money to buy media influence and sway public opinion, painting the populist agenda as anti-American and the Republicans as the party of prosperity. Their candidate, William McKinley, was a pro-business protectionist with a platform that urged for new trade tariffs to promote U.S. manufacturing. Throughout the election, McKinley remained in his home in Ohio, where he gave speeches to the press from his front porch and relied on the unprecedented generosity of corporate donors to fund his disinformation campaign. This anti-populist backlash proved successful, and Bryan was defeated. By the time he made a second bid for the highest office in 1900, the economy was much improved. The movement had begun to splinter into factions, so he lost by a wider margin. W.J. Bryan went on to serve as Secretary of State under President Woodrow Wilson and again made national headlines for his role as a prosecutor against the teaching of evolution in public schools in the Scopes monkey trial of 1925. Despite the dissolution of the People's Party, by the 1920s, much of their platform had been realized, including corporate regulation, women's suffrage, and the enactment of child labor laws. Another wave of populism rose up during the Great Depression. Once again, farmers' alliances joined ranks with the burgeoning masses of unemployed factory workers. The nation was finally ready for many of the reforms that had been promoted by the original populists in Nebraska. This was the era when the progressive populist agenda gave rise to the New Deal reforms of the FDR administration, reforms that made democracy function better for all people. Under Roosevelt's presidency, Congress implemented a raft of social democratic reforms and programs to create safety nets for farmers and provide social services and public jobs for urban workers, though it must be said that many Black workers and farm workers were excluded from these reforms. The establishment tried again to mount an anti-populist campaign to discredit the New Deal era reformers, but this time they failed to sway a population who was suffering under dire economic straits in the manufacturing centers and ecological catastrophe in the agrarian heartland. Again, in the 1950s, there was an academic anti-populist backlash, largely in reaction to the Red Scare demagoguery of Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin. The charge was led by one Columbia University historian, Richard Hofstadter, who represented an academic trend known as the consensus historians, who held that the general framework of the two-party system works because it is founded on basic agreements. Out of this theory, they propagated the persistent meme that all popular social movements are a threat to civil stability. He claimed that populist movements were historic incidents of mass delusion, that they were akin to freaks of nature, anti-Semitic, anti-science, undemocratic, and a genuine threat to democracy. Although Hofstadter's thesis was widely discredited by subsequent generations of historians, his definition of the negative populist took root in the American psyche. It is used by the establishment of both major parties to discredit grassroots movements of any stripe. Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont was the first major U.S. candidate, an independent running as a Democrat who was a self-described democratic socialist, to run on a New Deal-style platform since the 1970s. In the Depression era, the Democratic Party had adopted the populist agenda and become the party of the working class. But all of that had begun to unravel after the Clinton administration embraced free trade and globalization. The working class base of the Democratic Party had been drifting to the political right ever since President Jimmy Carter lost his bid for re-election to Ronald Reagan. All that began to change with the too-big-to-fail banking crisis in 2008 and the Occupy Wall Street movement that followed in its wake. By 2016, Bernie's progressive populist campaign was making new inroads into mainstream politics. Unlike the Tea Party and other reactionary movements that are funded by political action campaign PAC money from fossil carbon oligarchs such as the Koch brothers, Bernie's movement was funded almost entirely by individual donors of $50 or less. This was too much for the managerial class and the technocratic elites. As happened with the presidential campaign in 1896, the powers that be determined that Bernie's political revolution needed to be stopped, and the political machine effectively shut him down in both the 2016 election, when their candidate Hillary Clinton lost to Donald J. Trump, and in the 2020, when they opted to back the more centrist Joe Biden. Some social critics also point out that, despite being ideologically aligned, Bernie's campaign failed to connect in a meaningful way with the Black Lives Matter movement. In February of 2025, Senator Bernie Sanders, accompanied by Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, began the Fighting Oligarchy tour to galvanize bipartisan opposition to the Trump-Musk authoritarian agenda. The events have drawn record-breaking turnout in red state venues. Interestingly, the tour kicked off in Omaha, Nebraska, birthplace of authentic progressive populism in the U.S. Historian Timothy Snyder describes how the invention of the printing press in the 15th century caused social upheaval and confusion and even led to war, but eventually turned out to be a huge benefit to humanity. Snyder posits that we are probably in a similar moment with the internet, and it has helped push the American experiment in democracy to the brink. Identity has become a commodity that is tracked by cookies. The truth has become cybernetically deconstructed into many truths that serve as siloed constructs of self-reinforcing social media bubbles, which ultimately entrap people in closed-loop spirals of doom. In a democratic society, it should be possible to manage and regulate any new technology to make it more beneficial than harmful, given enough time. If we are to preserve freedom and democracy, every predominant cultural narrative needs to be countered with investigative fact-checking. The only way we will ever deal effectively with the existential threat of climate change is if we have an informed citizenry. Oligarchs and authoritarians rule with lies and fear. They convince people that there will be no future unless they are given the power to take us back to a glorious past, one that never really existed. If people are manipulated to be fearful of immigrants or climate change or inflation or whatever other bogeyman the great leader tells them to fear and don't believe in the future, they won't fight for freedom and democracy. They can be seduced by the authoritarian. It seems we may be ready for a new wave of authentic progressive populism to counter the takeover of the fossil carbon oligarchs. This moment urgently requires an informed and organized grassroots mobilization calling for a realistic response to the unfolding climate disaster. There was a brief period in American history where democracy appeared to function for the good of the common person, at least some of the time. It began with the emergence of the first populist movement in 1890, came to fruition with FDR's New Deal, culminated in Lyndon Johnson's Great Society of the Civil Rights era, and was ended with the 1980 election of the Republican president, Ronald Reagan. The only way the people ever really rule in this American democracy is when they are able to mobilize in mass popular movements. It may be true that revolutionary tendencies usually only ferment in the minds of those who are rendered powerless, those to whom revolution appears the only solution. But it is equally true that successful revolution comes through a wildfire of grassroots connectivity among a critical mass of the disenfranchised. That means mobilizing about 6 to 8% of the 99% of the population who are getting fleeced in Trump's nightmarish version of the American dream. Up until now, an important feature of the American form of democracy is that it has demonstrated a relatively high degree of institutional tolerance for mass mobilization of its citizens. If we have more people power in the society, that carries with it the responsibility to exercise that power, not only for ourselves, but also for those living under more repressive regimes, to be a voice for the voiceless. Although populist social movements rarely get candidates into the highest offices, they can push the more mainstream candidates and the powers that be that back them to integrate some of their policies and reforms. Movements to create change within the framework of existing government will never yield all the results we want from them. We can petition the government to provide leadership through a just transition in response to the climate disaster, but we can simultaneously promote people's assemblies to reinstill authentic democracy into the process. People's assemblies is a direct democratic process harking back to ancient Greece, whereby a cross-section of the society is chosen by a process similar to jury selection. The people's assemblies could become a truly representative body tasked to oversee the legislative process as they undertake a just transition to zero carbon emissions and land restoration. The assemblies would have advisory panels of experts to educate and guide them in the oversight process. If democracy fails, and even if it doesn't, we can always reclaim our own agency as individuals. We can come into our own power by committing to engage in local actions to love, protect, nourish, and restore this planet by whatever nonviolent means are necessary. Climate journalist and the author of Uninhabitable Earth, David Wallace Wells, describes the current moment as one that is entirely new because humans are now inhabiting an Earth that is hotter than it has ever been in our entire history. The saying goes that this is the hottest summer we have experienced and the coolest summer we will experience from here on out. The process of photosynthesis in plants shuts down at 116 degrees Fahrenheit, meaning that life stops at that temperature. At current rates of global carbon emissions and land degradation, we will hit 2 degrees Celsius annual average above temperatures above pre-industrial levels by 2050. That will be the hottest temperature the world has experienced in 3 million years. It is, in effect, a new planet. It is given into our hands to see how much of our old world can be successfully ferried over. Everything will be different. Everything has already changed. Can we adapt our technology and time to forge an ecological civilization? Can we radically shift the world's agriculture away from the industrial model that is killing the soil and poisoning the environment to one that is adaptable, resilient, perennial-based, water-conserving, and soil-building? In the early 1960s, Black ministers, under the leadership of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., made the strategic decision to create a coalition by having their followers unite with student activists, and took the further bold step of allowing the participation of school children in the marches. This united front, along with a growing contingent of white college students and activists from the North, proved to be too powerful for the upholders of the segregationist regime. Do we need to choose between revolution and evolution? Or is revolution an essential part of human evolution, a necessary protagonist in the process? MLK Jr. and Gandhi demonstrated that nonviolent direct action is both an effective strategy and a lived principle. It is a unique path to power in that it is most successful when it is practiced in service to the life force. The strategy has shown real results, and for many adherents, it has also proved to be personally transformative. The practice of nonviolent resistance can sow enduring seeds of change within the larger society. If we place ourselves in the living spirit of another species facing extinction, our own egos might begin to dissolve. The tight-fisted grip on our hearts, so traumatized by living under this rapacious capitalist system, can begin to release. The decolonization of our minds and hearts can penetrate even into our cells. We can taste freedom, feel it leaping like words of fire off our tongues. We understand that no single one of us can or should try to control the outcome of this movement. Paradoxically, it is time for all of us to step up and become regenerative leaders. We feel a co-emergent ecological awareness arising, a shared consciousness of our predicament coupled to a fierce love to try and save and restore wild earth, a spiritual quest to create a just society for all humans and all species, to create a planetary culture whose firm foundation is a healthy agriculture. our opposition, the fossil carbon industry, big pharma, agribiz, and weapons manufacturers all have billions to lavish out to their armies of well-heeled full-time lobbyists to conduct activism on behalf of their causes. They cleverly cloak their boss's agenda in the guise of conservative social issues that stir up culture wars. But we have the living power of the earth underneath our feet. For 10,000 years, agriculture has too often been part and parcel of the destruction of the natural world, but it doesn't have to be so. Small farmers and their allies can lead the way by embracing restorative practices. It is really important to emphasize that we aren't just talking about farmland and woodlot. Every citizen relies on soil, and so every one of us ought to be motivated to become caretakers of the land. No piece of land is too small or insignificant to be unworthy of reparation and restoration. We need full citizen participation to create food security and restore biodiversity, and to get our heads and hearts turned around right in the process. Whenever we feel the connection to the cycles of the seasons and the lives of the plants and animals, we are engaged in the biocentric movement. To have such awareness is in itself a profoundly revolutionary act within our disconnected digital society. This rerouting and reconnecting to the living earth is where there is real promise to turn things around and make human progress toward a regenerative global civilization.